Hello and welcome back to State of the Division on the quick rebound with UFC 305 on the tail end of August's late night show. All in, I'm not loving this card after writing this script. Maybe it's the little bit of a rush job I had to do a weird schedule thing, but I can at least say the main event is fun. Some major stakes ride on this Tuivasa fight. Erceg France, I think, determines the next challenger, or maybe another fight for Erceg before he challenges. Either way, there's placement on the line. And I think you have some possible up-and-comers sitting on this card. You have a few guys making their UFC debut, guys looking to cement themselves after a contender series and one other win, and you have a few guys who I think are kind of fighting for their roster spot on this card. So all in all, UFC 305, it feels like a letdown, but then again, I said that about UFC 301 and that card blew me out of the water. So here, we're going to hope that it's more like UFC 301 and that I'm simply being way too critical on it. That being said, we got Housekeeping and the Butcher's Bill. And we're going to start with Housekeeping. I went 8-6 on that last card, becoming a running theme, and while that is good, as my overall record has improved to 63-38, not exactly what I want. I'm kind of was hoping to start pulling ahead more with consistently winning more, and not simply kind of coasting off Vegas odds, making my calls correctly. I will admit my call for Blades was very much more favoritism. I probably could have easily bet an Aspinall and it would have worked out, but all in all, Bilal Muhammad being the other big, not really surprised, but take this with a grain of salt, none of you are going to believe me, but in my heart of hearts, I was really debating picking Bilal to win that. His style, while boring, is very effective, and I thought Leon would get caught in his pace and his tempo. In the end, I went with Leon, not exactly riding the hype, but kind of having faith that Leon would be able to set his own pace, break out of Bilal's pace. In the end, Bilal did what Bilal does, and he gave us a reason to remember the name. I don't care how corny that was. Moving on to the Butcher's Bill, as of recording, unless something has changed, I only have two. Gavin Tucker is no longer fighting Jack Jenkins. Instead, he will face a new opponent. And Teresa Bleda is no longer fighting Casey O'Neill. She is instead fighting Luana Santos. That's it for the Butcher's Bill, which is a pleasant replacement after these last few cards. That being said, let's jump right into it. Kicking this all off, 8-0, Stuart Nicoll makes his UFC debut and looks to stay perfect against 10-2. Jesus Santos Aguilar. Aguilar is a year younger at 28, either 1 or 2 inches in height, going to Nicoll, with Aguilar having a 62-inch reach with no numbers on that for Nicoll. Now, Nicoll's the newcomer, and as such, I don't have a lot of numbers for him, but in his career, he trends to being a finisher with 4 KO and 3 submission wins, and the lone decision win. On that note, he does tend to win in the first, but in most of his fights, it happens later in the first, with 4 of his 5 first-round finishes being at 445, 424, 359, and 429. I don't know how takedown heavy his game is, but he seems to be able to work off his back to some extent. Aguilar is the 3-fight UFC veteran and also comes across as a finisher, though with 6 submission wins in his career, he definitely trends more towards the ground. Looking at his numbers, he works a 149 to 1.11 in striking, which definitely highlights the ground focus of his style. And of course, he does have a KO win over Shannon Ross, but in total, there were 4 significant strikes thrown, which leaves me a little tentative to call that a trend. Now, on the ground, he works a 1.90 takedown average, which does speak to his tendency to go to the ground and work the control time, if not the finish. Vegas likes Nicoll here by a decent chunk, and I'm going to agree. While I normally do go with the UFC veteran in a lot of fights, and I will do that later on in this video, Aguilar doesn't blow me out of the water with his wins, and when his biggest strength is his ground game, being faced by someone Nicoll who's definitely a better striker, but also looks to have submission ability, and I believe at least the ability to survive on the ground, that kind of limits his game. And based on who he's won against, I think Nicoll's a step up in competition, and I'm also kind of running with the Vegas books here and kind of hoping they know what they're talking about. I kind of believe they do in this case. Aguilar doesn't blow me out of the water with his stats, his numbers, and his wins. And while I don't know much about Nicoll's competition, I do know that the way Nicoll has won seem to kind of match up well against the ways Aguilar has won. 21-8, Song, the Assassin Keenan, looks to get back to winning against 22-8-2. Ricky, the Gladiator Glenn. Song is 1 year younger, with dead even height across the board, but reach being 1 inch to Song. Song is a bit hard to get a feel for stylistically, but I think calling him a finisher is fair. He has 9 career KO and submission win. And that is somewhat reflected in his numbers with a 4.36 to 6.38 in striking, speaking to his reliance on that power shot, or how he has then had to grind and control the fight on the feet in even order to win. That KO power has been a little inconsistent, with his last KO being in February of 2020. In terms of the ground game, he works a 0.34 average, and it really seems like a recovery or disruption tool. Glenn has struggled as of late, with his last 3 fights being a loss, and a draw, but stylistically he works more as a grinder with a 3.94 to 4.10 in striking, speaking to his ability to match and hang into most of his opponents on the feet, but struggles with pulling ahead or taking the lead off striking and not just the control. On the ground, he only works a 0.55 takedown average, which shows his existence as a matchup tool versus any major part of his game plan. Vegas likes Song by a narrow margin, and I'm going to take a gamble here. I'm going to roll with Glenn. I'm very much kind of betting on Glenn's killer be killed nature, catching Song by surprise. Song hasn't necessarily struggled with getting knocked out, but he has been caught and knocked out. And I'm kind of betting on Glenn to come hot out the gate, to kind of put the pressure on, and to kind of go for that finish early and maybe get that shot across. Obviously, it's a bit of a gamble, but I feel this fight is pretty close. And I feel like Glenn, the way he's been doing, coming off 3 losses, is going to try to come into this hot and try to get himself back on a streak versus Song. 7-1, Tom Big Train Nolan looks for 2 in a row against 13-4, Alex the Executioner Reyes. Nolan is 13 years younger at 24, 3 or 4 inches taller, with reach being a dead draw across the board. Now, Nolan does only have 3 fights in the UFC, if you include the Contender Series, so I'm not exactly rolling with a lot of numbers here. But in the UFC, he has 1 Contender Series win, 1 loss, and 1 actual UFC win, with each fight ending by finish in the first and 2 of the 3 ending before minute 30 in the fight. So stylistically, Nolan is very much a finisher with 5 KO wins in his career and seems to have a dynamic striking style. Take these with a grain of salt, but numbers-wise, he works with a 9.26 to 6.54, which highlights the high-octane style where he piles on the strikes and overwhelms his opponent. Now, he was overwhelmed and finished by Nicolas Mata, 21-12 in strikes, but as a whole, he is all in on the striking with a 0.0 takedown average. Reyes is also a bit of a newcomer with only 2 UFC fights, both losses 6 years apart from each other. Stylistically, he looks like a finisher, but hasn't had any real success in the UFC, being outstruck and finished in both fights without ever really having a sort of success in that. Looking at the numbers, he tries to work with a 4.04 to 10.91 in striking, which isn't great, and an 0.0 in the takedown average. Vegas loves Nolan like the Guardians love giving me hope, and I will agree. Nolan is very much riding a hotter hand here. He's proven to have that knockout power in the killer be killed style. And while Reyes can knock people out, he hasn't shown it against higher level competition, air quotes in the UFC. But here we've seen Nolan do more UFC fights. He's been in the company consistently a little longer than Reyes has, and I think that gives him a slight edge. I think he's the hotter hand. I think him being younger is a huge plus, more athleticism, more explosiveness, and I think Reyes is coming in colder to this fight than Nolan is. Ending off these early prelims, I think 12-3, Jack Far Jenkins, that's Phar, looks to bounce back against the replacement, 11-5, Herbert the Blaze Burns. Jenkins is 5 years younger, 2 inches shorter, with 5 in reach, going to Burns. Now, Jenkins has some finishability and a history of it, with 5 career KO. In the UFC, he's had 2 decision wins and 1 finish in the Contender Series. As a result, I'd call him a striker, but more on the grinding side, where he outpaces his opponent and simply controls the flow of the fight. Numbers-wise, he works a 4.43 to 3.07, which does kind of show that grinding style. In addition, he works a solid 2.56 takedown average, though I don't know how it will fare against other fighters, and has been remarkably solid in 3 of his 4 UFC fights. Burns is the late-ish replacement here, and is very much a killer-be-killed fighter, with his first 3 UFC fights being first round finishes and his last 3 losses all being second round finishes. The numbers do highlight this a little, him losing big or winning close with a 1.73 to a 4.60 in striking. He does have a 3.0 takedown average, but the success of them is a little hard to determine, but he has been able to generate control time off them, though the control time varies depending on the opponent. Heavy favorite is Jenkins, and being boring, I will agree. Burns is riding a 3-fight losing streak and isn't exactly the hot hand here. Jenkins isn't a hot finisher, yes, I don't know if he'll finish the fight, but in his last 3 fights, he was leading the striking and seemed to be controlling the fight's pace very well in all 3 of them. Something I think Burns is going to struggle with if he can't get that finish early, like how he won those first 3. And he has struggled going deeper in the rounds, getting caught all in the second round, as I mentioned earlier. Into the prelims. 9-2, Casey King O'Neal looks to stop the skid against the replacement, 8-1, Luana Santos. Santos is 2 years younger, with even height across the board, 2 inches in reach, roll to O'Neal. O'Neal comes across as a fairly well-rounded fighter, capable of finishing the fight or controlling it all the way to the end as a grinder. She does tend to work with pretty high pace in her fights, with an 8.41 to 6.30 in striking, showing that off very well, plus that aforementioned finishing power, though her last finish win was in 2021. She also has a very effective ground game with a 1.77 average and the ability to pull submissions off, adding an additional threat level to it beyond some control time. Now, she can be outpaced and is coming off a finish loss to Ariane da Silva. Santos is the fairly late replacement for this fight and a relative newcomer with only 3 UFC fights. Stylistically, Santos leans more into submission in the ground game, but has found some finishability on the feet as well. Following that is a 2.03 takedown average and submission threat that she can bring out quick into the fight and end it early. She does seem to prefer initiating the takedown versus playing off her back, but does have a 66% takedown defense to help with that. On the feet, works a 5.33 to 3.21, which does highlight her striking pace, but doesn't highlight the lurking ability she had to KO her opponents. Vegas has it close, but gives the nod to Santos, and I will disagree. Yes, O'Neal's on a 2-fight losing streak, but my preference here comes from the fact that she is the UFC veteran and does have the higher striking output here, with a very comparable takedown defense and takedown average. While that could again work in Santos' favor, I think looking at that higher striking output and matching up fairly evenly across these two statistics gives the slightest edge to O'Neal, who could be coming in hungry, even if she is coming off a 2-fight losing streak. 11-3-1, Joshua Kuya Culibao looks to stop the skid against 16-6, Ricardo Carachina Ramos. Ramos is 1 year younger at 29, either dead even in height or maybe an inch rolling to Culibao, and reach being a definite inch over to Culibao. Culibao is an odd duck to try and get a feel for. He has a career record of 5 KO, 5 decision, and 1 submission win, so you could guess he'd be closer to a finisher in the UFC, but he only has a submission finish in the UFC, and that was in February 2023. So I'll call him a grinder on the feet with some finishing ability. Numbers show this with a 3.20 to 3.24 on the feet, highlighting the striking style used in the UFC and how it's been limited in terms of effectiveness. Rocks a 0.0 in takedowns with a 67% takedown defense, which also highlights the lack of control there. Ramos is more of a finisher in comparison and lives in the kill or be killed style for most of his fights. Striking numbers show this with a 3.21 to 3.74 and also highlight the reliance on power. I should also note he has some dynamic striking ability with explosive plays coming at a moment's notice. There also is some takedown game with 3.02 takedown average, but it has been turned against him with some opponents gaining the finish off of it. Vegas likes Culibao, and I think I will disagree here. Yes, Ramos has struggled with getting finished and Culibao can get the finish, but on the flip side, Culibao struggled with getting taken down. And while Ramos isn't the greatest takedown artist in the world, he rocks a 3.0 average, and I think shooting enough against Culibao can give him the control time he needs to win, set up some nasty ground and pound, or even possibly set up a submission win. All things I think he's capable of. Could Culibao win? Definitely, I think it's fully possible. I just think Ramos' takedown game gives him the slightest edge in my mind. Taking us out of the prelims, 5-2, Junior, the Juggernaut, Tafa, looks to get back to winning against 11-2, Walter, the Clean Monster, Walker. Walker is 1 year younger, 3 inches taller, with 3 in reach, and also going to Walker. Tafa is very much a classical heavyweight through his 3 UFC fights, with a heavy reliance on the feet and a limited ground game. Career-wise, he's working 5 KO wins across the board with nothing else on record. UFC, he works at 1.81 to 1.86, showing the swing and bang style, plus the power he's able to bring out. As a result, he obviously can be caught and finished in turn, but there's always a chance with this type of heavy. And in terms of the ground game, he has an 81% takedown defense and no takedowns on record. Walker only has 1 UFC fight on record, and it is a loss, but in his career, he worked 6 KO, 4 decision, and 1 submission win. Then in the UFC, despite securing 4 takedowns and 7 minutes, 19 seconds of ground control, he was outstruck 33-58 and lost the fight by unanimous decision. Vegas likes Tafa by a narrow margin, and I will agree. I don't have a lot on Walter. I don't have a whole lot on Tafa, so I'm kind of very much rolling with the money books here. And I think in this case, Tafa has a slight advantage. He looks to bring out that power a little more. We've seen him square up with UFC competition a little more. And I think Walter could get him to the ground, and that's going to be his big key to victory. But on the feet, I think the toughness and I think the heavy power that we know Tafa can bring out might give him the slightest edge there. 19-8, Li the Leech Jingliang squares off against 19-6, Carlos the Nightmare Prates. Now Prates is 6 years younger with either even height or an inch in favor of Prates, with reach being 7 whole inches in favor of Prates. Now Li is the old hand here and is definitely a finisher, with his last 4 wins all being by finish. I wouldn't necessarily call him a kill or be killed fighter, but he seems to rely on getting the finish in order to win, losing by decision a fair amount. Now striking is his strong suit with a 4.46 to 3.84, showing how he doesn't really dominate in the totals, but instead keeps it close and lets power be a separator. Style's fairly rounded, but not sure how explosive it really is, as this instead seems to roll a bit more standard MMA striking. In terms of the ground game, he works at 1.25, but it really seems like a recovery or disruption tool over a consistent control piece in his arsenal. Prates is a UFC newcomer with only 3 fights, 1 contender series, with all 3 ending by KO, with an additional 11 KO wins in his career. On that note, he's definitely a danger striker with a fairly dynamic style, mixing in some explosive moves. Now in the numbers, he works a 4.09 to 5.23, showing how he's willing to trade and rely on power to bring him back into the fight when he gets down and strikes. In terms of the ground, he has 3 submission wins, but in the UFC, has no takedowns with an 80% takedown defense, showing where he wants the fight to be most of the time. Heavy favors Prates, and I will agree. But I feel like I have to mention that Li has a definite chance to win this. Yes, Prates is younger, has a bit more explosive style, and can bring up that power a little bit more, but Li's been able to match fighters before. He's been able to catch fighters or just keep them in long enough to overwhelm them on the feet. Do I see him doing this in this fight? Not really, but I'd be remiss if I didn't mention there's a definite chance that he snags control early with a good shot, getting his power out to come out quick, and taking control of this fight and putting Prates on the back foot, which is something that I think is possible. I've seen Li fight a few times, and while every fight's a little different, him taking control of the fight early with a quick lucky shot or catching him in an exchange are all things that I think are definitely possible for Lee. In the end, I am going to pick Prates. I think him being 6 years younger, having that very explosive style and a bit more reliable power, I will say, getting it to come out more and win him the fights even when down, I think that all gives him an edge. But if he steps in exchanges, I have to acknowledge there's a definite chance that Lee could crack his chin first. 14-7, Thai Bam Bam Tuivasa looks to stop the skid against 14-5, Jairzinho, Biggie Boy, Rozenstruik. Tuivasa is 5 years younger with dead even height across the board, but 3 in reach going to Rozenstruik. As mentioned, Tai Tuivasa is the cold hand coming into this, and is very much the swing and bang type of fighter living and dying by the finish. I mean, 7 of his 8 UFC wins are by KO, and 6 of his 7 UFC losses are by KO or submission. In the numbers, he works a 396 to 505, which highlights that reliance on power and his chin to get to the end of the fight. In that same vein, he works an 0.0 in takedowns and only has a 57% takedown defense, which shows his problems with keeping it on the feet. Rozenstruik also comes across as a striker, working heavy on the feet, and I'd be willing to say he also shows up as a killer be killed fighter. On the numbers, he works a 344 to 278, which does show the difference in their striking styles and how he goes into the fight. Similarly to Tuivasa carries an 0.0 takedown average, but with a 75% takedown defense. Vegas gives the nod to Rozenstruik, and deciding live, I will agree. Does Tuivasa have a chance to win? Yes, he's got a decent chin, he's got power in spades, and he can end the fight in one shot and can pull off some dynamic moves. However, Rozenstruik is a little bit more measured and has a little bit more variety than Tuivasa does. And I think Rozenstruik's more measured style will allow him to kind of work his reach a little more, avoid some damage, and kind of attack the angles and attack the simplicity of Tuivasa's offense. That all being in Rozenstruik's favor gives him more avenues to victory in my mind. Even if he doesn't get the finish, he can drag the fight into 3 rounds, which I think Tuivasa won't be able to really succeed in that regard. 24-0-1, Mateus, Gamer Gamrot, looks to keep rolling against 23-12, Dan the Hangman Hooker. Gamrot is 1 year younger, but Hooker takes 2 inches in height with 5 inches in reach, also rolling his way. Gamrot is a ground-heavy fighter, focused on controlling the fight and keeping the pace as he wants it. Looking at his takedowns, he works a 5.28 average and will consistently land multiple takedowns for chunks of control time during a fight. Additionally, he carries a 90% takedown defense, which shows how he wants to control when this fight goes to the ground. On the feet, he works a grappler striking percentage of 309 to 307, backed up with some knockout power that he can call on to catch his opponent off guard. I will say he is outstruck in most of his fights by varying margins, but it doesn't always seem to matter too much with how good he is at controlling the fight on the ground. Hooker is a bit of the opposite sort of fighter, coming across as much more of a striker on the feet. In that way, he works a 508 to 476, and while he isn't completely a finisher, there's always a lurking chance of the hit with how he fights. But on the same hand, he's always in danger of being caught in turn. There is a slight chance of a takedown with a 0.79 average, but it's very much a situational piece for recovery and disruption. I don't really see it being used in this fight too much. Vegas takes Gamrot, and I will agree. Does Hooker have a chance? Yes, he just has to land that shot and keep the fight on the feet. However, with how aggressive Gamrot is in takedowns, with how he's very much always able to stack them, put you on the ground, and get those chunks of control time, Hooker's on the back foot pretty quickly and is very much relying on his power and his aggressiveness, keeping Gamrot away from securing those takedowns. That's a pretty big ask in my opinion. I think in that point, the odds go to Gamrot. For the co-main event, 24-11-0-1, Don't Blink, Kai Kara France looks to re-enter title contention with a win against 12-2, Steve Astro Boy Erceg. Erceg is 2 years younger, 3 or 4 inches taller, with Kara France taking 1 inch in reach. Kai Kara France, like his ring name, is a striking-focused fighter capable of ending the fight in a blink, with the finish ability that can catch you out of nowhere. Looking at the numbers, he rolls with a 4.57 to 3.24 in striking, which does highlight his willingness to step in and swing. This has allowed him to get caught once or twice, but oftentimes it does work in his favor. Striking style does have some variety, and given that it is a lighter weight class, there's some definite explosive there that can catch opponents off guard and swing the fight in his way in an instant. There's some semblance of a ground game with a 0.63 average, but doesn't show up in all of his fights. It feels more matchup orientated. Erceg has a limited UFC sample size, but as a whole, seems like a pretty well-rounded fighter with some preference for the ground and controlling the fight. In terms of the ground, he works a 1.24 average with takedowns in all but one of his UFC fights, but as seen against Pantoja, other fighters can take control of the ground game and use it against him. On the feet, he works a 4.52 to 4.20, which speaks to a sort of control style where his opponents never get left too far behind him, but he's constantly dictating pace and action in the fight. Here, Vegas likes Erceg, and going out on a limb, I'm going to disagree. This is a close one across the board. But my main reasoning being that Erceg tends to get hit more in his fights compared to France. And given how France fights, those sudden bursts of explosiveness and upping the pace that he can do, I think if he starts landing on Erceg very quickly, very suddenly, he can swing rounds in his favor or even get Erceg to stumble and end up in a finish situation. I don't know how likely that is, but in my mind, that's enough to move the needle in his favor for my decision. For the main event, 21-2, Driscus still knocks du Plessis. Looks to stay perfect in the UFC and defend his belt against the former champion. 24-3, Israel, the last stylebender, Adesanya. Du Plessis is 5 years younger. Adesanya takes 3 or 4 inches in height, with another 4 inches in reach going to Adesanya as well. Du Plessis is a bit of a weird fighter to describe stylistically, but if I'm going to go out on a limb, I'll say he's a power-focused finisher, capable of controlling the pace of a fight, but always seems to work the finish in the end. He does possess some serious toughness, which helps him wade through some shots to apply pressure or overwhelm his opponents in turn. Looking at the numbers, he works a 6'4'9" to 4'7" in striking, which shows how he's able to work the lead on the feet, with also the dangerous power that he can bring out. Backed up by takedowns and submission ability with a 3 flat takedown average. Does only have a 40% takedown defense, but he has shown the ability to survive his opponent's takedowns, get back to his feet, or work off his back. Adesanya is Adesanya, and that's really all I need to say. For the sake of doing this, Adesanya is a very technical striker. He does tend to get the finish, but he doesn't always need the finish to win. He has a good variety and is always good at working his range and paces the fight to keep moving forward and peppering his opponent with shots and working angles as well. In striking, he works a 3-9-3 to 3-1-1, which does speak to how close some fights can be, but consistently he tends to come up with the edge. He has shot takedowns, but a .05 average doesn't give the image that is a consistent part of his game plan, and instead it is probably recovery and disruption. In terms of avoiding the ground, however, he carries a 77% takedown defense, and has shown the ability to survive takedowns and get back to the feet against much heavier competition as well. Vegas has this even, so I got no easy way out here. But I think I'm going to roll du Plessis here. Adesanya can definitely win. There's very logical ways for him to win. But in my mind, the key for du Plessis to win relies on him being able to constantly advance in Adesanya, not letting him put the pressure on you, which is his toughness, which we've seen. I want to believe it'll match up in this fight. Plus, he has a very powerful and active takedown game. While Adesanya can survive takedowns, and he's often shown the ability to negate some of them, someone like du Plessis getting you on the ground, that's a huge chunk of control time. That's damage, that's energy expended. That's a winning a round in a way. And I think him being able to have that aggressive takedown game, being able to power his opponent to the ground or against the cage and stifle their offense or limit their ability to really do a lot to gain a lot of points to get the judges' favor, is something I think that will help du Plessis win in the end. Well, in the end, that's UFC 305. And as I said, there's some interesting fights on this card. There's some new people entering the UFC. There's some fighters looking to make a name or rebound from a loss. There's some interesting things on this card. Just all in all, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of this card. But in the end, these are my thoughts on the winners. These are my thoughts on who I think is going to lose it. Go ahead and leave your opinion in the comment. Tell me what you think I got right, what I got wrong, and tell me what you'd like me to do different. So all that being said, thank you for watching, and have a good fight.